Prologue. A hedge of privet, a world apart. In the county of Westmarch, where hedgerows keep counsel and the lanes remember old hoofbeats, two estates faced one another like sober neighbours who never quite agreed. Ravenscourt, vast and ancient, the seat of His Grace the Duke of Ravenscourt, and Ashdown Grange, respectable but modest, the home of Squire Nicholas Ashdown. Between them ran a boundary of privet and thorn, a living line of class and habit and unspoken rules. It was along that hedge that Nicholas at 25 first saw Lady Arabella Ravenscourt, a brightness in pale blue walking with her companion, head bent over some wildflower she had rescued from the verge. He tipped his hat then, and she glanced up, eyes clear as the Lydford brook, and smiled with the quick candour of one who has not yet learned to fear her own heart. Nicholas had been taught to keep his distances, from debt, from cards, from London fashions, and above all, from dukes' daughters. He was a careful steward of average means, land enough to keep his tenants employed, not enough to be noticed. But love, that unbecoming advocate, lodged itself and would not be argued down. It made an idler of him in the evenings and a poet of him in secret, and by spring he knew he loved her as surely as he knew how many lambs had dropped in the north meadow. Lady Arabella, for her part, discovered that her days were strangely punctuated with blushes. At the sight of a bay gelding on the far rise, it might be his. At the tread of a confident step, surely not his. At the mere mention of the Grange, which could only be coincidence. She was daughter to a duke, bred for tam seasons and titled suitors, yet she found herself treasuring remarks about hedging schedules and the state of the barley, as if they were verses of Shakespeare. Her father, His Grace, was not a cruel man, only a careful one, and careful men erect walls of principle and stand atop them like sentries. She did not imagine the wall could be climbed. Thus began a courtship that could not be named, set between a hedge and a house of stone, and watched, as such things are, by those who profit from shadows. Ashdown Grange. Nicholas Ashdown woke each dawn to an estate that fit his hands. He knew the weight of every gate, the cough of every hinge, the temper of every horse. His widowed mother had passed away the year before. His sister, Margaret, Meg, kept the Grange with a competence that made the housekeeper near redundant. Tom Allardyce, the head groom, had served Nicholas's father and spoke to the horses as if they were vicars and he their parish clerk. It was a year of middling yields and honest anxiety. The south pasture wanted draining. A tenant's thatch needed repair. The cider press listed to one side like an elderly seaman. Nicholas kept his accounts with the same decency with which he kept his word. He paid late if he must, but he paid. It was not the life of a grand gentleman, but it had a dignity that came from being sufficient unto itself. On certain mornings when business called him toward the northern boundary, Nicholas's bridle hand would act as if on its own instruction, guiding him along the hedge where wild roses climbed. He never contrived to meet her. He told himself he would not. And yet there were Tuesdays when the companionable silence of the hedge would break, and there she would be. Cheeks fresh from the breeze, bonnet trimmed in something discreet but cheerful, and a book of Cooper or Thompson tucked into her palm. They spoke rarely and little, of weather, wildflowers, a cloud, and returned home with their hearts heavier and their step lighter. The Duke and his house. The Duke of Ravenscourt had the habit of power, a measured voice, a brow accustomed to bows, a mind that kept accounts of a different sort. He loved his daughter, though love in him resembled a ledger. He kept it balanced by duty. He had lost a son at 12 and a duchess at 32, and sorrow had not made him tender. It had made him precise. The estate would pass to a cousin if Arabella married poorly. Such things were not spoken, but were carved into the oak of his study. Within that house, 2 women guarded Arabella's happiness in their different ways. The Dowager Duchess, his mother, small, bright-eyed, a little deaf and yet keen as a linnet, kept a fond watch from her sitting room, knitting what she called nonsense shawls and observing everything. And Miss Honoria Fielding, Arabella's companion, plain, excellent and quietly romantic, believed in love as if it were a sacrament. Ravenscourt watched the county. He saw the Squire of Ashdown as one sees a sound cart horse, admirable, dependable, and never to be harnessed to a carriage of state. He took pleasure in his daughter's goodness and dreaded its consequences. Men who have known grief become craftsmen in prevention. 3. A suitor of station. By late spring, a suitor appeared in the person of Bartholomew, Earl of Davenant, 50 if a day, wealthy, widowed, with a manner like old velvet, soft at first touch, then smothering. He had the sanction of position and the applause of certain uncles. He had also a taste for other people's fortunes. His steward, Mr. Keating, moved like a shadow behind him. His man, Pike, would later be found wherever mischief had come confidently to work. The Earl presented himself as a rescuer from caprice. He admired Arabella's prudence, by which he meant her obedience. He paid compliments that resembled contracts. The Duke, seeing a solution that would chink every crack in the family wall, entertained him. Arabella, hearing her prospects weighed like gold, felt a rebellion rise that surprised her with its ferocity. "Your Grace," said Davenant one afternoon, drawing his chair closer by the library fire, "my name is plain." "My prospects are plain. I will settle 30,000 on the lady at once and add to it the manor at Hartley. I ask only what any husband may ask, her companionship, her good sense, and a home kept in decency and order." "Her happiness?" the dowager's voice floated from a corner. She had been sitting needle in hand, quite still, like a carved saint that suddenly speaks. Davenant smiled thinly. "Happiness follows duty, ma'am." "Sometimes it limps behind," she said. Arabella curtsied, murmured something about fresh air, and escaped to the lawn. There are afternoons in which a life seems to split like a path in a beech wood. She turned toward the hedge. They met by chance and by every intention of Providence. Arabella stood on the far side of the hedge. Nicholas, walking, paused, hat in hand. "Ahem, Lady Arabella." "Squire Ashdown." Formality rescued them from foolishness for a breath or 2. Then the hedge took pity and rustled with the small conspiracies of thrushes. "My father favours a match," she said at last, cheeks not quite steady. "An arrangement of estates and good sense." Nicholas inclined his head. "I wish him every success in both." She laughed, a sudden startled thing. "Do you? How economical of you!" He looked up then, and the regret in his face was so unguarded that she, who had never been cruel, said softly, "Mr. Ashdown, I have learned lately that good sense can be a tyrant. I am not so much in love with prudence as I was last winter." There are sentences that alter the course of the day as a hidden current alters a boat. Nicholas felt the ground shift. He spoke carefully as a man walks a narrow bridge. "I am of small account, ma'am. I could not presume. I have a roof that does not leak, if it does not rain too hard. Tenants I value, and a meadow that dreams of drainage. I am not the man a duke commends to his daughter." "No," she said, "but you are the man she sees when she looks toward the hedge." They did not touch hands, they were not fools. They parted as 2 persons might part who have signed their names in ink that will not show until it is held to the fire. The Earl's Game. Lord Davenant was no romantic. He rehearsed outcomes. He did not like the look that came into Lady Arabella's eyes when she returned from her walks. He did not like the Grange, tidy, insufficient, faithful. He did not like the squire himself, whose honesty rendered a certain class of threat useless. That sort of man is difficult to bribe and impossible to sneer out of existence. What does a squire own? Annoyed, Davenant asked Mr. Keating, tapping his finger on the armrest. Fields, my lord, and his name. Let us muddy both. Thus began a diligent campaign. Whispers in the market that Ashdown was behind in his rents. A letter, anonymous, suggesting he had gambled away a tenant's savings. A poaching charge contrived by a snare set at the edge of Ravenscourt's wood, and a hare thoughtfully deposited by Pike, where Ashdown's boot would find it. Reverend Blythe, stout man of the parish and friend to both estates, puzzled as he received two confessions that contradicted each other perfectly. Nicholas met the rumours with an even voice and open ledgers. His tenants answered with a loyalty that astonished him. "Let them talk, chuckle," said Tom Allardyce, hand on a mare's neck. "A man stands taller when the mud slides off his boots." Still, mud leaves a trace. Invitations grew scarce. The Duke's steward, Mr. Pritchard, a decent soul caught between fear and conscience, began to treat Nicholas with a courteous distance designed to discourage presumption. Nicholas bore it, as one bears the weather. 6. The Road in Twilight. It was in early September, on a road that ran like a ribbon between hawthorn hedges, that fate cast off its disguise. His Grace, returning late from a visit to Colonel Fortescue, took the shorter lane. Prudence sometimes yawns, with only his coachman and a footman. Twilight gathered, owls took attendance. The carriage turned where the lane narrowed near Lydford Bridge. There, where the hedges closed in and the trees knit overhead, 3 men stepped from the dusk with cudgels, one tall, one narrow, one thick about the shoulders. The coachman hauled the horses, the footman leapt down, and then the footman did not get up again. The Duke, opening the door with more courage than most would guess, found himself faced with a demand and a torch. "Your purse, your Grace," menacing, said the tall one with an awful politeness. "Take it and go," firm, returned the Duke, his voice the same one he used at quarter sessions. "Ah," chuckle, said the narrow fellow, "but there's the matter of the case in the boot." It was not accident. The case held papers regarding certain Ravenscourt investments, papers Davenant would have found instructive. The torch bobbed closer. The Duke, thinking of his daughter, drew himself up in that tall way of men who have faced illness and grief and will not be cowed by mere men. He had not calculated for a bay gelding pounding toward them, nor for a rider who did not calculate at all. Nicholas had taken the lower lane to avoid a cart on the high road. He saw the torch before he saw the men, saw the carriage before he recognized the crest, and then there was no thought left in him except this: help. He did not fight like a gentleman. He fought like a man who had mended harness and felled trees and thrown hay bales in winter. He caught the cudgel meant for the Duke's head on his forearm, felt something give, heard a crack. He drove his shoulder into the tall one, sent him stumbling. He took a blow to the temple that sang stars into the world. He saw the torch arc toward the coach and swiped it aside with his sleeve. It burned through the cloth and kissed his skin cruelly. He could not have described the rest. There was mud and the copper taste of blood and his left knee refusing to govern. He held one man by the collar and discovered he had strength enough for 2. Then a third struck him from behind and the world grew soft and far away. When he returned to it, the footpads had scattered, the coachman was calling, and the Duke of Ravenscourt was kneeling in the road, his fine coat muddied, his hand awkward on Nicholas's shoulder. "Mr. Ashdown, Your Grace, don't attempt to rise. Would not dream of it, Nicholas murmured, and sank again. 7. Convalescence and calculation. Ashdown Grange became a wardroom. Reverend Blythe arrived with prayers and practical bandages. Meg ordered the house as if it had been waiting all its life to do this work. Tom walked the yard like a sentinel and slept in the stable with a cudgel. The physician from Lydford stitched and scolded and muttered about cracked bone and merciful thick skulls. Ravenscourt sent wine, broth, ice, books, and, on the third day, he sent himself. He came in person, without announcement, which astonished the china on the mantelpiece and nearly cost Tom his composure. The Duke entered Nicholas's chamber and stood at the bed with a heart he had not expected to bring with him. "Mr. Ashdown," he said. "Your Grace," Nicholas croaked, face pale, arm set in splints, temple a map of bruises. The Duke bowed his head. It was not deep, but it was bow enough to rearrange the furniture of the room. "You have my gratitude," he said, "and my apology. It is a poor kind of man who underestimates what he does not own." Nicholas attempted to smile. "I have lived long enough to misjudge your Grace. The correction is always the more expensive lesson." The Duke's mouth twitched. "We shall see about the expense." He paused, and in that pause a father spoke through a duke. "My daughter owes you more than I can bear to reckon. I shall come again." He came again. He came so often that Mr. Pritchard, stupefied, rearranged his ledger to accommodate miracles. The Dowager Duchess came as well, bringing orange marmalade and a conversation that hopped merrily from topic to topic, and returned always somehow to the subject of happiness. Miss Fielding brought books and the precise sort of sympathy that does not bruise a man's pride. Arabella did not come, not at first. She would not risk scandal for the sake of selfish comfort. She sent flowers, very resolutely. But when the Dowager observed that love is a fortress that must sometimes risk its standard, permission found its path. Their first meeting after the road was not romantic. Nicholas was propped on pillows, desperately conscious of the absurdity of his bandages. Arabella stood at the door, hands folded very tightly. "Mr. Ashdown," she said, and then, "Nicholas," so softly the name seemed written in steam. "Lady Arabella," he answered, and could think of nothing else on earth to say. They spoke about the weather for 5 minutes and about the poetry of Cooper for 10. When she left, he discovered that pain could be grateful for being, meanwhile, simmered with talk. Some meant well, some meant harm. Davenant meant calculation. He had not ordered the robbery, such dispatch was beneath his dignity. But he recognized his dog's footprint. Pike had acted with an independence that made his lord uneasy. Worse, the event had altered the Duke. Gratitude is a solvent that loosens long-set mortar. "Keating," Davenant said, "do you know what I dislike more than a poor man? A brave poor man. Remove him." "How, my lord?" Keating's voice was the voice of a man who has spent his life composing plausible deniability. "Use whatever means leaves my hands clean." 8. Fire in the night. It began as a rash of small accidents. A girth cut that snapped under a rider, a gate unlatched that let hogs into barley, a lantern found toppled by stable straw. Tom Allardyce, no philosopher, nonetheless understood that chance does not repeat itself with such tidy malice. He set a watch and caught only silence. The attempt came where villains are bravest, at night, in flame. At 2 a.m, the barn glowed in its rafters like a lantern. Tom rang the yard bell, Meg roused the maids, and Nicholas, half-heeled and head swimming, staggered to the yard. "Keep back," Tom cried, but Nicholas had no talent for safety when others were in need. He went in with a wet blanket over his shoulders and came out with a calf pressed against his thigh. He went in again and came out with a boy of 12, little George Tanner, coughing and cursing weakly. He went in a third time because habit is stronger than pain, and the beam that fell would have split his skull had Tom not dragged him clear, swearing into his face with affection and authority. When the embers were blackened and the last bucket set down, Reverend Blythe took Nicholas by the shoulders. "This is not Providence," he said. "This is a person. Find him." They did not have to look far. A man too eager to be helpful, a stranger with the smoke still on him. A coin that bore the arms of Davenant's house. Pike, held in the tack room with a rope around his wrists, smiled through a broken tooth. "You think the Lord will stand by me?" he asked Tom. Tom considered and then smiled back, with less teeth and more certainty. "No," he said, "but our vicar will stand by the truth, and the magistrate will stand by the vicar." Pike's courage waned accordingly. 9. The Reckoning at Ravenscourt. There are days that gather themselves into theatre, and this was one. The Duke held a hearing in his oak-panelled hall, not because he enjoyed ceremony, but because he understood its power to make truth visible. The magistrate sat at one side, Reverend Blythe, solemn as a bishop, Mr. Pritchard with papers, the dowager with knitting, which had a way of making men speak plainly. Nicholas, bandaged, stood only because pride refused the offered chair. Arabella watched from the gallery, hands white in her gloves. Davenant had been invited under the courtesy due his rank. He came because disdain is as fatal as curiosity. Pike, loose-tongued now that liberty had been exchanged for terms, told a tale with more detail than prudence. He had laid the snare, set the fires, cut the girth, all on Keating's orders. He had not, he insisted, intended murder on the road. Just the papers, he said, though his eyes flicked, under their own governance, toward Davenant and then away. Keating, pale and tidy, denied everything and then, under the quiet of the Duke's gaze, denied less. He had not known what Pike would do. He had only sent conversible suggestions. He had accepted funds he could not entirely account for. He had never intended harm to his grace. The word harm sounded too. The word harm sounded to him like a legal term with a margin of interpretation. "And to Mr. Ashdown?" the Duke asked, voice low. Keating swallowed. "He is hardy." Arabella rose. She did not often speak to a room that mattered, and when she did, her voice did the oddest thing. It grew soft, and people leaned in to hear and found themselves quiet. "Hardy men feel pain, sir," she said. Davenant stood when it became clear the tide had turned. "There are men who can survive any disgrace if only they are permitted to leave before the applause." "Your Grace," he said with measured offence, "I will not bear insult from hired ruffians and sentimental girls." "Nor will you deal it," said the Duke. The magistrate cleared his throat. "My Lord of Davenant, you are not presently accused, but your servants are, and the law will not be deterred by titles if evidence points a certain way." Davenant smiled, a slash of a thing, and bowed. "Then by all means, gentlemen, pursue your quaint notions of justice." He turned as if to go and found Nicholas in his path. For a moment the two men regarded each other, one with wealth and grievance, the other with injury and no grievance at all, only a resolve that would not be shifted. "Move," said Davenant, the word low, a coil of threat within it. Nicholas stepped aside, because he had no taste for dramatic gesture, but he spoke as Davenant passed. "You threw fire at my house," he said, "and you sent your shadow to cut me from my saddle. If you cannot love, at least learn to leave. It is a useful art in civilized counties. The dowager's knitting clicked once neatly. It sounded like a verdict. A father's hour. The hall emptied, as such rooms do, carrying whispers like dry leaves. The Duke remained. He stood a long time looking at the hearth as if embers could render judgment. At last he turned to Nicholas. "I am an old man, Mr. Ashdown." "You are not." "I am old in habits," he amended. "And a man's habits are the last of his children to leave him." Nicholas waited. It is rare wisdom to let a father find his own words. "I have kept my love like a room with the door closed," the Duke said, "to protect what it holds. Today I opened it and discovered the room itself had become a prison." He drew a breath, and when he looked up his face was plain, shorn of role, of practice, of position. "You have my blessing." Nicholas bowed his head, not to a duke, but to a father. "Then I have everything I ever dared not hope for." The Duke's mouth moved with something like humour. "Not quite. You will need patience. The papers must be prepared, settlements arranged, a dozen unromantic labours for which no one thanks us. You will also need to forgive an old man his stubbornness." "I can begin at once," Nicholas said. "I have had practice forgiving myself for stupidity. Others are easier." They shook hands, an agreement forged of gratitude and love, and a certain practical Englishness that prefers solid bridges to splendid speeches. 11. The Earl's last throw. Men do not always know the hour in which they become villains. They arrive at it step by step and discover, when they look down, that the staircase is gone. Davenant had retreated to his manor with the fatal determination of a man who has mistaken his will for his worth. He could not endure to be thwarted. He could not imagine a world in which desire did not confer right. So he reached for the oldest tool in a small soul's box: desperation. He sent Pike's brother, less competent but more frightened, to waylay Nicholas on the high road to Lydford, there to contrive an accident with a bolting team that might leave the county tut-tutting about the hazards of autumn roads. What Davenant did not calculate, he had grown careless with other men's characters, was that Captain Julian Trevelyan, Arabella's cousin, lately returned from service abroad with a sabre scar and a cheerful contempt for cowards, had taken it upon himself to shadow Nicholas for a week. Julian had an old soldier's taste for good company and an itch for usefulness. Thus, when the team came thundering down the lane, harness cut, eyes rolling, Julian's mount moved as if it had learned duty with him, and they bracketed the carriage like a pair of parentheses. Nicholas leaned once into danger as if danger were a door he could push wide, and caught the lead horse by its bit. The animal shuddered, bore down, and then remembered that men had been kind to it once and consented to stand. The driver wept. The boy who had cut the harness attempted to run and discovered that running from a cavalryman is an exercise doomed not in theory, but in the first 5 strides. There are times when gentlemen prefer not to involve magistrates, not to protect guilt, but to spare foolish youth the weight of a public ruin. The boy was taken, the name was taken from him, and it was Davenant's name again, like a stain that blooms wherever water touches it. That afternoon, while the Duke listened with a face that had learned to be still, and the Dowager muttered "Enough is enough," as if it were scripture, the Earl of Davenant laid down his last card. He challenged Nicholas to a duel. The instrument was a letter thick with contempt, and the vocabulary of honour misspelled. Nicholas read it once. "No," he said. Julian grinned. "Quite right." The county, of course, had opinions. Some called it cowardice, some called it sense. Nicholas called it stewardship. "I cannot be both a husband and a ghost," he told Reverend Blythe, who approved with such warmth that he nearly embraced the squire in the aisle. Davenant, thwarted even of melodrama, grew erratic, and erratic men are careless. Keating, determined not to be dragged into the abyss, visited the magistrate with a ledger's worth of repentance. The law, which had taken its time, moved briskly at last. Charges were read, servants were questioned, papers were seized. Davenant departed Westmarch of his own will before the warrant could decide it for him. He left Hartley Manor to the nettles, and a reputation to the newspapers, which are as kind as crows. There is a kind of hush that falls over an estate when happiness is preparing its rooms. The hedgerows put on flowers as if dressing for company. The kitchens of 2 houses invented puddings. Ravenscourt allowed himself the luxury of being a man rather than a duke for half an hour each day, during which he would visit the Grange and talk of drainage with unnecessary interest. On a morning sunlit enough to shame any doubt, the church at Lydford filled as if the county had enlarged by half. Arabella wore ivory that laughed softly when she moved. Nicholas stood with his arm still a little stiff, and his heart absurdly steady. The dowager, in a cap trimmed with something like defiance, sat where she could see everyone's face. Miss Fielding, who had borne up through every turn with quiet hope, cried, and then laughed at herself and cried again. Julian winked at Tom. Tom winked back with such gravity that it became a benediction. At the moment appointed, when the vicar's voice had made a nest for vows to rest in, the Duke stepped forward. He looked at his daughter and everything he had lost, son, wife, the careless assurance of young fatherhood, passed through his eyes and left them clearer. He placed Arabella's hand in Nicholas's and covered both with his own. "Take care of my child," he said, "and take care of my county." Nicholas bowed his head. "With my life." "Already proven," murmured the dowager, and wiped her eyes as if they had been dusty. Outside, when the bells raised a quarrel of joy, the hedge that had kept their secret hope for so long stood between 2 houses now joined by more than proximity. Children ran between the gates as if no hedge had ever grown there. And in the evening, when the last guest had gone and the last ribbon been unpinned, Arabella and Nicholas walked to the old boundary and stood, hand in hand, where the privet rustled. "It was always here," she said. "What was?" "The way through." He smiled. "And I was busy admiring the hedge." She laughed, and the sound stitched the day to the morrow. Epilogue, harvest. Years are made of ordinary days. The Grange learned laughter, and Ravenscourt learned to borrow it. The Duke discovered that doting is a science as rigorous as accountancy. He practiced on a grandson who took his first steps in the long gallery to universal applause. Reverend Blythe's sermons acquired a dangerous streak of romance. Miss Fielding married the apothecary. Julian returned to his regiment, and then returned again to stay. Tom Allardyce declined all offers to be head groom anywhere else on the grounds that he had no desire to be promoted out of contentment. As for Davenant, his name became something gentlemen invoked when warning their sons against confusing desire with right. Keating, contrite with a thoroughness that surprised even himself, kept accounts for small farmers and grew fonder of plain tea than anyone thought possible. On an autumn afternoon some years later, when the barley stood like scripture in the field and the hedge hummed with what hedges hum with, Nicholas and Arabella walked the boundary again. The world had not become kinder, it had merely become more honest. Love does that, not by abolishing sorrow but by teaching us to reckon it without cheating. "Do you ever think," she asked, "how narrow the path was? A hedge, a road, a night, a hand." He lifted her hand to his lips. "I think," he said, "how lucky I am that when courage knocked I answered, and when forgiveness asked, you opened." She smiled up at him. Husband, you improve with recollection. Wife, he said, I improve with you. They turned toward home. The hedge, which had always known more than it was credited with, watched their going and kept its counsel. Above it, the sky widened like a benediction, and the bells in Lydford, having rediscovered happiness, rang as if an old friend had returned and meant to stay.